Hello, welcome to the HackShack W480, API 101. This session is called API Basic and the value they provide. So in this session, we will cover the principle of application programming interface, that's API. This is really a 101 course, which I created after observing a lot of my colleagues struggling with API-related concepts. Before we start, let me just say a few words about myself. I have been with the company, or should I say companies, for 31 years, starting as a software engineer at Digital Equipment Corporation. So I've always been a software guy in a hardware company. But times are changing at HPE, and I'm glad today to be the tech lead for the HPE Dev Community Program. I do happen to live in the south of France, and today I'm presenting from home. I guess most of you are in the same case. And if I'm not, I'm at my desk. You can find me on my mountain bike or hiking or playing bass or even cooking in my kitchen. The HPE Dev content, HackShack content has been designed by the team as a set of notebooks. And those workshops will use Jupyter Notebooks as a technology to deliver this. What happens with Jupyter Notebooks is that we use in the same single document the code snippets that we would like to run with you together with the documentation. So there's no jumping between windows, so it's very convenient for delivering hands-on labs. So what we will do, as I said, 101 talk. You don't need to be a developer to follow along. We will not make you a developer after the end of this session, but we hope that we will better equip you to discuss with developers. You will learn what is an API, what is the jargon used within API or building to build APIs and to use API. You will understand the technology involved in using APIs. And we will provide you with a little bit of hands-on experience calling a real API at the end of the workshop. You will not need to write any code, don't worry. Everything is pre-written, but if you want, you can make changes to that code and run it live. As I said, you can follow along the exercise, and we deliver this through Jupyter Notebooks. At this point, you should be ready to connect to your notebook, as we call it. You should have been assigned a student ID through email, and if you have not, then you should speak up in the chat window to one of the SME. We will help you out. The password to connect to your notebook using your student ID is stu lowercase disco uppercase 2020, and the URL for the notebooks is notebook.hpedev.io. At this point, I will flip to a different window which will be exactly the same as you guys, which will be a Jupyter Notebook. And when you guys connect, you will get to a folder called Discover. And if you double click on Discover, you will find a workshop called API 101. In the API 101, you will find a first, we call it notebook, called README first, and we'll start with this README. This is just to give you a chance, to give me a chance to explain to you how we manipulate notebooks throughout this lab. So this is about understanding API basics, and the flow is that we will follow a notebook, as I'm doing here, by scrolling through the notebook. If you like this notebook, you can always right-click at a notebook and download, and this will make the notebook available locally on your machine. If you want to continue working on this notebook, for example, on your own, you can install Jupyter Notebook on your machine. This is an open source project that you can run on most platforms. We have links here to help you get started with that. We provide you with an environment, so you don't really need to do that now because you can run all the labs within our Jupyter Hub environment. This workshop has only one lab. Some other workshop you will discover in the HackShack have more than one, but here we only have one. So we'll just follow the link here to get started. Before I do that, I would like to point out at the top of the screen here, we have a little play button, and this is to actually execute a cell. A notebook is made of cell. A cell can be either code or text. Actually, it's not really text, it's markdown. So this is only text, so there's nothing to run. But you will see that in the next notebook, which is this one, there will be pointed where we have to run the code that I would like you to run. The best experience for running those notebooks is if you open that notebook yourself, make it full screen, and just listen to me. You don't really have to watch my screen in that sense that I am actually scrolling through that and talking about what's in the notebook. So you can do the same. And I will make some connection to some synchronization points when I am about to run some code, so we are all at the same place in the notebook. But for the rest, you can pretty much follow along by just scrolling down the notebook with me. So let's get started. So understand API Basic and the value they provide. First part is about understanding that I build this content because I run throughout my career across many colleagues that were extremely technical people. They knew inside out the product that they were selling. They know how to do demonstration, how to install, how to troubleshoot, how to debug. Everything was good, except that they were always using the GUI of the product. Whenever asked about API, integration, automation, they always felt like outside of their comfort zone. They always had a hard time because these were developer concepts that they were not comfortable with. So they were interested by the subject. So in many cases, they wanted to learn more, but they never had the confidence to do that themselves. So I built this content to explain the basics and get people to be more comfortable with APIs and what they are used for. The main reason is, in many cases, our products have really good differentiator, and that if you don't explain to customers what the point is about APIs with our products, then you lose a large chunk of the capability of the product. And nowadays, software is really important. So people need to know that piece. So you need to be comfortable with that piece as well. So application programming interface, so that's API. They allow, in a nutshell, in one sentence, they allow you to make or to interact with an application programmatically. So meaning from a script, from a command line, a CLI, a web page, anything. Developers use API to integrate with a software component and build more complex use case or open up to new business opportunities. So in order to explain how to use this API that in most cases we have in our own products, we need to understand how APIs are built and how you can consume them. Some years ago, it was not so easy to use an API because there was no clear standard. There was a standard body trying to create something called SOAP. Maybe some of you, the older ones, remember that. It was very difficult to put in place. You needed to be a real developer to understand that. It was extremely complicated. And then there was this person, Roy Fielding. He was working for its PhD thesis, and he created this architecture. It was not really a program. It was an architecture, a design of an architecture that he called representation state transfer. And the acronym for that is REST. And this we called REST API. And if your API implements those principles that he described, we can say you have a RESTful API. And in many cases today, people use RESTful and REST interchangeably. So it doesn't really matter. One is a noun, one is more like a name. But you could say that a RESTful API implements all the REST concepts defined by Roy. Such as, and we will see that Roy was very successful, and this became the real de facto standard, becoming even more important than SOAP that has completely disappeared from the radar because he used only existing technology that everybody had already implemented, such as HTTP, HTTPS, and JSON. And this is what we're going to talk about. First of all, let's talk about endpoint. We call an endpoint, which is really how you get connected to an API. If you're familiar with HTTP, which most of us are, you heard about a URL. So that's a uniform resource locator. So that's kind of the thing you put in your address bar in your browser to get to a web page, for example. API use the same concept. They use an URL to get to an endpoint. So in API land, we call this a endpoint, but it's really like more or less the same as a URL in your browser. So once you get a endpoint, for example, we have here a few examples that I listed, which are calls to an API endpoint. For example, here you see, this is my one, I call it my OneView address. So this would be the IP address of a OneView instance / REST. So that's kind of the beginning of where the API is implemented. The next one is my ILO. So this is the IP address of an ILO / Redfish / v1. So this is where the endpoint for the version 1 Redfish API embedded in my ILO would be found if you were to call the API. This is for HPE stuff, but if you look, the last link I put here is really an Amazon API example. So designer of an API or service on the internet decide what is the endpoint. You see that OneView has decided that it's going to be /REST, Redfish is different, and Amazon is different again. So there's no rule on what an endpoint should be. It's just an URL that you can get to from another piece of software. The next thing is, let's talk about HTTP verbs. When REST was designed by Roy, he basically used all the available verbs that were available in HTTP. We are not so familiar with some because we know GET pretty much because we use GET in our browser. By default, when we put an address in an address bar on Chrome or Firefox or whatever, we implicitly say we want to do a GET. Actually, the browser don't even display that anymore. In the beginning, in the early days, they did. But there are more than GET as a verb. So there is GET, there is POST, there is PUT, there is PATCH, there is DELETE, and a few more. These are the most important ones. Actually, the key point about REST API as defined by Roy was that with those 5 verbs, you can design an entire API subsystem that other people can call. So you will see that we will use you will use when you call an API multiple verbs. So for example, this, just to give you an idea, GET obviously retrieves data from a website, but in API land, we say it retrieves object instance or the property of object instance. When you do a PUT or patch, you actually are modifying object properties of existing objects, and there's a subtle difference between how you use PUT and patch, but there are 2 different ways. Let's keep it like that for now. POST is another important call because these verbs really say you are going to create a new object of a certain type. And this is very common for starting a session because in many cases you would like to create a new session, for example, to log in to an API, and you will start always by doing a POST to a session so you can log in, providing your credential to log into an API. And finally, there's a verb called delete, which obviously deletes an instance of an object on the API side, on the application side. Okay, so we have 5 different verbs to explicitly say what is the action we would like to take on this API. Now we need a little more because, as I just mentioned, we need to log in, for example. So for this, you need to pass some data to the API. And so to do that, we have multiple ways. The first one is we could use something called HTTP headers. And this is also in the specs from HTTP since day 1. So you could create a header, or you can create multiple headers to your API call and say, for example, I want to accept content or a response of type application JSON. So this is basically a way you can specify through what we call a key pair. So this is a string and for a key and a string for the value, some additional properties. One of them is, for example, accept, meaning I would like to get the result of the API in a certain format because I'm expecting that format because I will analyze the data and do some things on this data, and I expect the result to be JSON. On the same type, you find a very common header called content type, which says, I am providing you with data in a certain format, because API could accept more than one format. You could accept text, XML, and JSON, for example. We will see JSON in just a second because this is becoming another standard. So you could think about HTTP headers as properties that you can add to tag your call to the API to specify some additional properties. So in a way, it's a technique to pass some data back and forth with the API. The second technique is the payload. Some calls, like a post, allow you to pass something that we call sometimes a body, or sometimes we call it a payload, which is the content of the message. So it could be in multiple formats, and that's why you need to set a header to say, hey, this payload is JSON, or this payload is text, or this payload is XML. And this is where you would put, for example, credential to connect to Nilo or connect to a OneView instance. As I mentioned earlier, you can use multiple formats, and some APIs would accept multiple formats, and you would just use a header to specify which one. But nowadays, many people have standardized on JSON. JSON is an existing standard called, which stands for JavaScript Object Notation, and it's been vastly adopted by people building API and consuming API, obviously. So JSON this is an extract of JSON, for example. It looks pretty much like XML. I think it's a little more readable, and it's always going to be a key pair, as I said earlier, for headers, for HTTP headers, which is a key, like in this case, username, and a value. If there are strings, they're always double-quoted, and then they are separated by comma. So it's always going to be a curly bracket open, curly bracket end, and a comma separated list of value, key values. If you can have different types, I mentioned string, but if you look at the second example here, we have age is an integer, so it's not quoted, it's just a value. And you can have more complex construct. For example, if you are querying for the users of a system or a subsystem, there's a fair amount of chance that is going to be more than one. And in this case, you see that the result in JSON will be using square brackets to indicate that it's a collection of items. So here you see square bracket and then another curly bracket that says it's an object made of, it's an object with a more complex construct, which is basically a user, which has a last name, a first name, and an age. Last name and first name are strings, so they are quoted. Age is an integer. So this is typical JSON, and you'll find a lot of APIs that will return values with collections that way, with members, for example, and tell you the count. Just to let you know that if you want to analyze this data, you will have two items, and you need to look up in a loop, for example, member one and then the second member. So headers can be anything. They have not been standardized in the name, the keys, for example, but there are well-known keys that people are using. For example, accept is a well-known key for saying, okay, please provide me the response in JSON. Content type is also a best practice term that says, please give me the results. Oh, sorry, I am giving you results. Sorry, I'm giving you parameters in JSON as well. So if you're building an API, typically you would use those, but you can come up with yours. Some people have implemented headers to provide the token to get in an API once you have obtained a token. So you will see that there's no rule on the names of those HTTP headers. So let's put it all together. We know that we need, for calling an API, we need a URL, which is the endpoint. Sometimes you will see also a term called URI, Uniform Resource Identifier, which is basically a URL, but for an object and usually it ends up with a UID, which is like a big string, a big number that specify an object instance in that API. We need a verb to say what is the action we want to take on this URI or this URL. We may or may not have a few headers to specify some parameters on the connection to say what type of data you accept or you provide. And finally, you may pass a payload if the call you are making requires you to pass data to the API. For example, here is a few. You can say, I want to get, so with header accept JSON, and you do the URI would be, or the URL would be /res/servers. So you're basically asking, in this case, this API here, OneView, at this address to retrieve the list of servers, and you would like the result formatted in JSON. The next one is more interesting because this is using post. So if we're doing a post, again, we are calling the OneView instance IP address of a OneView appliance, and we do /res/login session. So post, remember, we would like to create a new login session. So we create a new login session, and we would like to provide the payload as JSON, and the payload is the following. So this would be username, password, and this is the minimal information that I have to provide to get a valid token and log in to my OneView instance in that case. So this is the equivalent of logging in to the GUI of OneView. An example here of delete, you could use delete /res/login session to terminate your login session. This would be the equivalent in the GUI of logging out of OneView. Okay, so that's pretty much all there is in terms of concept behind an API. Now let's look at the tooling. There's a couple of things that we can do to experience and experiment, I should say, with API. The first one, as I told you, get is, you can only do get with a browser. You cannot do any other verbs. So it's not a good tool for exploring APIs. Also, we will do, you will see that we do only get in the examples that will follow, but browser is not an option. So what else do we have? There is a tool that is a command line tool that many people using Linux or Unix, all sorts of Unix, know very well, called curl. We call it curl. You can use curl, that's fine. There is a version, and we will use curl in this hands-on lab because we can run it from the notebook. And there are versions of curl for Windows as well. So if you are running a Windows machine, you can download curl and run it from PowerShell, for example, if this is what you have available. The quickly most important parameters in curl are these ones where you'll be able to pass, and you will recognize here what I just explained. If you do a -h, you will be able to pass, for example, a HTTP header. So you see, it's just a quoted string that says accept, application/JSON. So this creates a header. So that's -h. And if you have more than one header, you just say -h and another -h. And you could say -d and pass a payload. And now you know what the payload is. So if you just specify JSON, you can say -d, and then you would quote a full JSON payload here if you have to. X, a -x, allow you to pass what is the verb that you are doing. By default, if you don't put any x, you'll do a get, but it's always good to specify what you want. So for example, you could say -x get /res/version, -x /post, and so on and so forth. You can use -k. It's pretty convenient when you want to bypass SSL, self-signed certificates that might otherwise block you from connecting to to a device. And if you're working from within a company, you might want to use X to set up a proxy as well. So for example, you could use curl to say, okay, curl, I want to include this header, and I would like to do a get on this URI to retrieve, for example, the version of an HP OneView server. if you don't like command line tools, and I can understand many people are used to use graphical user interface, there is a fantastic tool which I use a lot, which we don't use here, although you could do the lab in parallel to the notebook using Postman. So this tool is an open source tool called Postman, and you can download it from here and install it on your laptop. Actually, I would recommend you do that because this is a very convenient tool to keep on your laptop to be able to explore any kind of API. Once you have the basics, you can go on your own and start exploring, poking around, saving all the information. So next time you come across another OneView, another ILO at the customer site, you can demonstrate and show some of these calls on another environment. So take a look at that, install that. That's my recommendation. I will show you both curl and Postman as we continue. The next thing we need is an API. If you attend some of the other workshops, you will see that we use APIs from HPE product, but I wanted this workshop to be autonomous, doesn't rely on anything else but available things on the internet. So I looked up for public APIs on the internet. You can look it up yourself. I found an interesting catalog here of available services. I also wanted one where you didn't have to subscribe, and there are plenty of API services that you need to subscribe, even for free, but you still need to register and get a token and so on. This one was a free, didn't need any registration, and is available on internet. So I selected that service, which provides weather reports for cities, major cities on the planet. So I looked at the documentation and I thought, okay, we can use that. So some of you can do it with Postman, otherwise we'll do it with curl within the notebook. So if you're doing with Postman, you will recognize, I've just described this quickly, you will recognize the verb, the get that you can select, or you can use post if you have it installed. You can see the endpoint, which is the URL here. You can see in blue the send button to issue your call. The big, you can see headers here. If you click on the header tabs, you see that I have created a header for accept application/JSON. You can have more than one. What else? On the left side, I think this is a really cool feature. You can have collections. As I said earlier, you can, for example, here you see I have created a collection for weather report, and I have two requests, one to get the code for Paris and the other one to get the weather from Paris using that code. So you see, you can start building knowledge and keeping track of those API calls in your collections. You can export those collections as JSON. You can mail them to a friend. You can exchange collections with other people using Postman, and there are thousands of people using Postman. But as I said here, we're going to use the command line interface and we're going to use curl. So at this point, I just want to check that everybody's in sync with me. On the notebook, we are reaching a first cell where there is code to be executed. I mentioned the fact that cells are either text or a markdown, exactly, more precisely, but you see this cell here is a smaller one, and this is typically code that you would like to run. We would like to run together. So on the upper right corner here, you see that I'm using bash, and you could select in the notebook other languages. We're not going to do that because the code I have written in my notebook is really bash and nothing else. But you will see that some other notebooks during the Hack Shack might be using PowerShell or Python. So this is very nice because you can have embedded code within your notebook in up to 60 different languages are supported by Jupyter Notebooks. But here, let's stick to bash. And in bash, we're going to make very simple things. We're going to use Paris. I picked Paris because typically this is a city that is available in the database, and also because it has usually very bad weather, so we can make fun of that when we live in the south of France. So let me just say I want to use Paris, but if you are brave enough, you can go edit that field and change to something else. Okay, so if you wanted an even worse weather condition, you might want to take London, for example, and try the lab with London. But right now, let's stick to Paris. You can always come back after the end of the lab and do more by changing some of the values here. So let's run what I will do is I will save Paris in a variable called city, and then I will do a first call to the API. I will specify that I want values back in JSON with a -h. I would like to do the verb get, and the endpoint of my API is this one, which is I want to call the search endpoint with a query. So this is just a query, don't worry, that's documented in the API, and pass the value of the variable which I set here, which is Paris. And I will use a little tool here, which is a very handy utility called JQ, and this is to parse JSON in a nice way, so it looks good when you display. So if you want to run a notebook, sorry, run a cell that is code, you have to use the play button at the top. So if everybody is ready, we're gonna do that all together. So city Paris, make the first call to retrieve the code. It's called the where on earth ID of Paris in this database. All right, so we have a result here. You see that's actually, if you remember what I said, it's a collection. So because there could be more than one city that match the query you put here, there's only one here in that case. We see that it's called Paris. It's a city. The where on earth ID, WOEID, is 615702. Okay, good. And we even have the latitude and longitude of Paris. Okay, so how about if we do it again, and this time we extract with JQ. Typically this would be done by a programmer or a developer in his code, but here we do it in the script. We extract just this piece. We just want the value of the where on earth ID. So we do it again. So we run that together. We see we echo the value that we have in this variable called where on earth ID. Okay, so we extracted the code. Let's move on and find out what the weather is in Paris. So if you do it in Postman, for those of you who install Postman, you would have to do a get on the next endpoint that we'd like to call, which is /API/location, then / the ID that we just retrieved, 615702, and then hit send. Because we are hardcore developer, we use Bash. And we're going to do it with curl. So let's do that. This time we do a get on another API, which is location, and we pass the variable that we stored, in which we stored the city code. So let's do that. We're using the run button again. This is fetching data from the API live. And we see that we have a number of records. Actually, there's quite a lot of information. If you were a developer building a mobile phone application, you could use this, for example, to find out the weather for the next coming days within your application and provide that information to your users. So you see there's too much data in there. So let's try to use the magic of JQ, which is quite cryptic, I have to admit, but bear with me for that, and just run again and extract just the weather for the 5 coming days. All right, so let's see what we have. We have for June 8, we have light rain, then heavy cloud, then light cloud, then light rain, heavy rain, then showers. That's what I told you. It's kind of funny. Anyway, you can go back to this and do the lab again as much as you like, and change the city to another city and do the same exercise. All right, so that's the end of the session. We've been able to call an API. I have to admit it was a simple one, and we did only get. So, but this is just to give you a hint and give you maybe the curiosity to go and try with some of the tools you're using in the office, some of the software that you have in place that have an API, because guess what? Most of them would have an API. It's just a matter of you trying to find out, be curious about it, and try to find out how to use it. For example, within a HPE, we have API for all the components, including hardware components that we provide, whether it's a OneView, SimpliVity, Redfish with all the ILO, which are embedded in our servers, or Nimble, or you name it. But they all operate with REST API following the same principles. So this terminates the workshop. Hopefully you've been through it completely. You've been able to call your first API and get the results, understand the concept behind API, whether it's JSON, whether it's HTTP, the verbs, the headers. We will ask you to fill up the survey. We have a survey specifically for our workshops. When you're done trying with the different cities, please use the file logout to cleanly log out of the platform. And with this, I will flip back to the PowerPoint slides to terminate the session and to wrap up. As I said, we have a survey. It's really important that you give us feedback, as this will help improve the experience, also to find out what kind of workshop you'd like to see in the future. If you like the experience, I strongly suggest you download the notebooks, install Jupyter Notebooks on your laptop. You can then edit the notebooks and run the notebooks. To get even further, as I said, please install Postman on your machine, or curl if you're more like a hardcore CLI guy. Be curious, start calling APIs when you encounter one. Look up how you're supposed to authenticate, how you get a token, and store these in collections in Postman, so you can learn from that and maybe exchange and share with other people this knowledge. And the best way is to join the HP Dev community. And for that, we have a number of options for you, whether it's just a website, maybe you're more like a chat guy and you'd like to discuss on Slack, we have that option as well. We send monthly newsletter. We also have a Twitter account, and we have Yammer groups for HP people and for our partners. Thank you very much for your attention.